Irvine Arditti, first violin and leader of the Arditti Quartet, which was formed in 1974 specifically to play contemporary music.
How do you like working with young composers?
Well, sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. It depends on the young composers. But I think generally it's very important to work with young composers, particularly for me, because it's trying to help and educate and inform, a better word, young composers, some of whom will be composers of the future, maybe. And I like it because I feel what I'm doing is a great service with my experience of working with so many different sorts of composers over the years, and to give that experience to young composers is I think a very important thing.
So you appreciate giving them advice or helping them develop their style or find more stuff in their piece that they weren't thinking about?
Oh yes, of course, because a long time ago I realized that it was important to play bad music as well as good music. Not for me, but for the composers. Mm-hmm. Because if a composer wrote a piece that wasn't good, wasn't interesting, whatever, often composers hid behind the performance and they said, oh, it wasn't played properly.
Okay.
I'm talking about complex music that needed very crafted performers. But if I or my quartet played something, then usually the standard is extremely high of quality of performance. And composers couldn't say that, so I think it was very important to have that for composers who didn't write such good pieces, so they could hear their bad pieces played well. And they couldn't say, it's the performer's fault.
Yes.
And then they would improve, hopefully. They would learn from the experience of what they'd written. Mm-hmm. So, a long time ago, I considered that important in certain situations, places like Darmstadt, where there's a course where there are young composers coming, even to perform those sorts of pieces in concerts. I think it's important for young composers to have that experience, mm-hmm. and to know where to go. I won't even say improve, but develop.
Okay.
Because a piece is written and it's finished. You can revise it, but if it's not really good, then you move on. The composer moves on to another piece. So I think the experience of having it perform well. Of course, there's always a danger that the performance is so good you can't tell the piece is bad.
Yes.
We had a critic once in London, quite early on in our career, by a very famous writer, Paul Griffiths. Mm-hmm. He used to write for the Times and then New Yorker, and he wrote the libretto to Elliott Carter's opera What Next? And he wrote a book on string quartets actually also. And he wrote this review, and we were a few years, like 5 years into our existence, and the headline was, "These guys must be stopped," or "These four must be stopped."
Okay.
I think he didn't use guys, he was
a bit more respectful.
He hadn't been to America yet.
Okay.
Or at least not lived there. And I thought, oh my God, it's the Times newspaper, we've got a terrible review. And I started reading the review, and as we went along, the review became more and more glowing. And the essence of it was that we were dangerous because we could fool people, critics, audience, whoever, into thinking that the pieces weren't so bad by taking the pieces and taking them somewhere with the interpretation that they shouldn't have perhaps gone because the pieces weren't that good to start with.
Yeah. I think this is crucial for composers because sometimes they write things that they actually don't know how those things could develop in the hand of a great performer. And have that happen throughout the years with some composers, because you've worked with many composers for decades actually. And did you see a development on that side after their bad pieces were performed by you?
Yeah, I think so. Composers improved. Mm-hmm. I won't mention any names, but I think
yeah, of course,
some did, some didn't, because of course people are only capable of what they're capable of.
Yes. Okay.
And some of those composers are not heard of anymore. Mm-hmm. There's also that way to develop out the door.
Yes.
Not continuing.
Mm-hmm.
And some developed and wrote different things, changed music, kind of went into other styles, found themselves maybe, and maybe the early pieces were too derivative of other people, other composers.
Okay, yeah, that's one important point. When you get music from a composer you don't know, do you dismiss it as if it's derivative, or, I mean, what is the criteria you use to choose the piece it's worth for the quartet or for yourself to play?
Well, many people think I choose criteria, but often I don't. The repertoire is chosen by promoters.
Oh, okay.
I mean, often I have a big feedback, and if I think a piece is good, then I program it somewhere, or try to program it. But a lot of the repertoire is chosen by people who know what I and the quartet can do.
I see.
And so we're asked to play things like that, or young composers. And stylistically, I'm not going to comment too much on young composers, but most people know what an Arditti type piece should be like. Basically a composer who's aware of what's been going on and writes in an interesting style. Something that is challenging for the listener, challenging the intellect in some way. Not easy music, but of course can be some sort of easy music that has other qualities. Can be anything really.
Yes. Do you pick music that you like yourself for the performances of the quartet too?
Well, yeah.
What I'm trying to ask is if there is something that you really love to do and you do all the different styles because of the professional commitments, or?
I have very wide and open taste. I like doing all sorts of things.
Okay.
But it's easy to see which quartets are popular with audiences. Different sorts of audiences. People who are used to listening to contemporary music, or people who are not. And some pieces have a great effect, like the second quartet of Ligety, which I think is a masterpiece. It has a great effect and people can appreciate it. So these pieces are nice to play because you can communicate them easily. There's a sort of timing in the piece too that works.
How do you see yourself in the communication part, yourself and the quartet? Do you think you're transmitting the ideas of the composer? Do you think you are using the text and giving your voice to the audience?
I think it's both. From the very beginning, we decided to work with composers from the very first concert, and work with composers to develop an interpretation as they wanted to hear their pieces. And very soon we incorporated our concept of how it should sound too, so that the responsibility of the interpretation was not entirely on the shoulders of the composer. And so then over the years we got quite knowledgeable about how to play certain pieces and could instruct composers who didn't have a lot of experience of how to play their music by just playing it. And then you'd ask a composer, how was that? And they'd say, perfect, just as I wanted it.
It's good.
As Luigi Nono did when we first played to him his Fragmente Stille string quartet. Knowing the composer, I mean, I knew composers' music before we came to them with a string quartet or solo violin piece. I knew their music. I knew most of what they'd written. I was listening to these composers from early teens.
Okay.
I knew most of the pieces Xenakis had written, Stockhausen had written, before I came to playing their string quartets for the first time. So how to play their music was clear to me.
Okay, I see.
I was not coming blind just from a quartet point of view. I was coming from a new music enthusiast point of view, and I think that's what made the difference. That's why the Arditti Quartet was so successful, because of our enthusiasm for what we did.
I see.
And composers and audiences were able to feel that and hear that.
Do you have interesting stories or memories from working with those great composers when they were young that you would like to recall? With Ligety, for example, or Chelsea, or I don't know.
Well, Ligety liked extremes. He taught me about extremes in interpretation, extremes of aggression, extremes of passivity, extremes of loud, extremes of soft. He wanted to extend those extremes far beyond what a normal classical player would think of doing. Because if you're playing a melody or an accompaniment in a classical piece, it has to be at a certain volume.
Mm-hmm.
But in contemporary music, you can extend at the soft end and the loud end. It can get quite aggressive and wild.
Mm-hmm.
I remember he always used to say, "Play like crazy," was one of his expressions, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of fascinated me. And he was very, very nice and very good at expressing what he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
But he had a friend, Mr. Kurtag, who I met later. Of course, we performed all Kurtag's music and recorded it all as we did with Ligety, with his presence. But Kurtag was a very refined chamber music teacher. Ligety was a composer who knew how he wanted his music to go. But I think he was not a teacher of performance.
Mm-hmm.
And we were in Cologne once, many years ago, and we changed players in the quartet. I think second violin had changed. So it was after we'd first played the Ligety pieces and after the first recording of them on Vergo. And I communicated with Ligety and I said, yeah, it would be very good if we had a rehearsal before the dress rehearsal, just to remind ourselves, so what you want, and we have a new player in the group. And he turned up. We arranged the rehearsal in our hotel. They had a conference room which we could work in. And he turned up with Kurtag, and he said, "This is Mr. Kurtag. He would like to listen to the rehearsal. Is that okay?" I said, "Yeah, fine." And we started playing the first quartet, which is a very classical piece. And we started playing a few bars, and the other instruments come in, and then I come in, da-dee-da-dee, da-dee-da-dee-da-dee, and I just started playing. And Kurtag started getting up from his chair, as he was famous for. He'd raise himself slightly. I won't do that now. But he'd raise himself slightly, and he'd go, and he started doing this. And I didn't stop playing, but I looked at Ligety with my what's going on look, still continuing to play. And then Ligety started speaking. I think we stopped playing. And he said, Mr. Kurtag knows my music better than I do.
Wow.
And what he meant was, Mr. Kurtag knows about chamber music playing better than I do.
Okay.
And then we proceeded to have a 2-hour lesson on how to play Ligety's first quartet with Kurtag.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm.
And it was great. It was great. I didn't mind it at all. It was very instructive. I mean, to say that we never had a lesson in our lives, Arditti Quartet, never studied with anyone. It was my enthusiasm for new music that started us and kept us going, and then meeting composers and promoters and whatever kept us going, of course. But we never had a lesson on how to play string quartets.
Mm-hmm.
Never. So it was quite nice to have a lesson from Mr. Kurtag. He was a very knowledgeable man, great musician. And of course after then we proceeded to have lessons from Mr. Kurtag on how to play his music,
Mm-hmm.
Which was also a great experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when we recorded his quartets, we spent more time with him in the studio than any other composer. We gave him more time, we gave him an enormous amount of time. I don't remember how much, but because we knew he wouldn't be satisfied easily. So
Mm-hmm.
we recorded his quartets, and it was a great experience.
Mm-hmm. How do you deal with the expectations of a composer, in the sense that there is a limit on the time you can work with a composer? You could, even if you work for weeks or months in preparing a piece, but there's also always a limit. Did you have to deal with that before?
Not really, because we work quickly,
Mm-hmm.
so we don't take weeks or months.
Mm-hmm.
We take minutes or hours.
Okay.
And if composers want different things and are demanding, then we try to give them what they need.
Mhm.
It's simple.
Just
The idea was not to have a time limit as much as possible. But, more and more, the players in the group were only playing in the quartet and didn't have other commitments. Of course, they had family commitments, but if a rehearsal was extended for 1 hour because we didn't get to the end of the piece or the composer wasn't happy, then it went on for another hour.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't looking at the clock. Sometimes, of course, you have to.
Yeah, yes.
If you have to catch a plane.
Yeah, those are the scenarios.
Yeah.
So, from that, can you name a few of the most challenging works? Because, of course, you're known for playing extremely hard and difficult pieces, but do you have some composers or pieces that you remember as being absurdly hard to prepare?
Well, I think in the early days things were harder because we hadn't had the experiences of doing it. But once you get to know the styles, then things become less challenging.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose the most complex was probably Fernihal. Complex, normal notation, normal playing. I say normal, but in a sort of a traditional way, but the complex rhythmically, and this needs to be worked out before you put the instrument under your chin or between your legs or whatever. You need to work out what you're doing and where things come in relation. So we do a lot of groundwork before starting to play, because everything you play goes into your brain, and lots of people learn wrong. Pupils come to me and I say, no, that's wrong, that note's wrong, or this rhythm is wrong. They try it again and they make the same mistake. They try it a third time. I say, you've learnt it very well, wrong. And the best thing is not to learn it too much in the first place, so that you have the possibility to change. So if you can play things quickly, you don't commit them to your inner self too quickly, and then you can work with the composer, modify things where or if necessary, and then commit it to your inner self and know how to play it. And I think that's been a very important aspect. I just touched the microphone, so I'll say that again. I think that's been a very important aspect of Arditti Quartet.
Mm-hmm. Yes, see, you're actually telling me that you are connected to the reading of the music and you don't memorize it. You just work the music and you're always seeing it right there. Right?
Well, I never memorize it because I have a bad memory, a very bad memory. And I think people have retentive memories or they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Some people can memorize lots of things, photographic memories, they talk about that. But I personally don't want to remember everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I'm gifted with a reading ability, so that you often find that people who can memorize things are not very good at reading them in the first place. They need to learn them. So I'm one of the people that can access music. I use a computer word, access music very quickly, but then can dissolve it quickly too. And I think that's perfect for the sort of way I've carried my life on, to be playing a lot of music, a lot of pieces that will only be played once or twice or a few times, and some pieces that will be impinged in the quartet repertoire forever. And so it's important, as I said, that I play not so good pieces too, so that people can evaluate them. I don't need to evaluate them. Listeners can evaluate them.
Yes. Do you worry about the education on string players in general, but on performers in general, regarding the relationship of memory and learning new pieces and how fast you can learn new repertoire? Do you think that's something that should concern performer more?
I don't know if that comes into question with me, because the people I teach, people who are talented at playing new music, I think are adaptable and can do things fairly quickly. And if they can't, they have to go away and practice and make sure that the corrections are put into their memory banks or their inner self. I have had people come and play very difficult violin pieces to me from memory, and then when I tell them something should be changed, they find it quite hard to change it once they've committed it to memory, much harder than I would playing a piece from music.
Yes.
So I don't like that. I think it's actually not a good thing to learn a piece from memory from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Not until you really know how you want to play it for the rest of your life.
I see. Yes. How was it playing from a helicopter?
High, loud, vibratant. Is that a word, or did I just invent it?
Well, it's fine.
I don't know. But I think you got the message. Well, it was great, as I told Stockhausen when we came down. He asked me how it was, and I said, wonderful, Carhens. I would like to play the entire repertoire for string quartet from a helicopter. And then he never asked me any more questions. But I loved him, really. He was so serious, and I loved to make jokes with him. He didn't always know how to take them, but I think we both admired each other's capacity. His to be a great composer and write wonderful pieces, which of course drew me to him in the first place, and I think he admired the way the quartet worked and our vision for doing things. And so we really got on very well. I like to tell the jokes, of course, but we had very many hours, serious hours, working and deciding, and also with input from the quartet, from myself and other members, on how we should perform the score. We worked with him for 3 days solid on the string quartet part of the piece before we brought in the helicopters.
Okay. Would you tell me a bit about Celibidache, the conductor? How was meeting him and working with him?
Well, that's gone off at a tangent and sent me back quite a few more years.
Yes.
I mean, Helicopter Quartet was, I think, 95 or round about then.
Yeah.
95, 96, I don't remember. But Celibidache was part of my time when I was in the London Symphony Orchestra. And I was the co-concert master, and I was concert master for several concerts that Celibidache gave. And I found him a fascinating musician, a fascinating conductor. I didn't have so much experience in those days. We're talking about 1978, 1979, when I was mid-20s, 25, 26. I didn't have so much experience in the orchestra. I'd been there for a couple of years. But I found him a fascinating musician. What fascinated me about him, he treated the orchestra like a chamber music group. And orchestral players are conditioned, they know the pieces, they played them with so-called great conductors before. They know the way it goes in their mind. But Celibidache had other ideas, so he had to dissolve their concept of interpretation and start again from the beginning. And he had many rehearsals, the sort of rehearsal period you would expect with a German orchestra, who are much more heavily sponsored than London Symphony, a private London orchestra which is used to 2 rehearsals, then a dress rehearsal and a concert. With Celibidache we had a whole week, because he insisted on that. He wanted his interpretation and not a stale other conductor's interpretation. And he took things down to the roots, and I remember he asked the timpani once to listen to the second violins. And I think the timpanist never cared who the second violins were. Maybe he didn't even know. He was a very fine timpani player, actually, but I think he balked at being told to listen to the second violins, their melodic line or whatever. I don't even remember which piece it was in. I just remember the comment. And it was a little bit difficult situation for me, being the concert master, being very young and quite inexperienced. Half the orchestra loved him and half of them hated him. I think it was more the younger guys who loved him, who weren't so indoctrinated by the way things should go, imprisoned by other conductors' interpretations. Fine conductors, and why should they change in their mind? So there were those people who hated him and hated rehearsing passages time and time again. But he got a wonderful openness in the orchestra. You could hear things with him that you didn't hear with any other conductor, because he achieved a balance that we never heard before. And it was particularly effective in music like Ravel and Debussy, this sort of impressionistic repertoire, where there are lots of textures and where sometimes you don't hear everything that's written. And it's interesting to have somebody listening and balancing that finely and making a different sort of music. In saying that, in order to do that, he had quite a lot of slow tempi.
Okay.
And for me and for many musicians, sometimes the drive of the music was lost because the tempi, I won't say it was too slow, but it was slower, often much slower than other conductors had as their interpretation of a work. And so I think for a lot of musicians, the music lost their drive with him. You had the textures being heard, but the line was difficult to carry through. You can't have everything, but he was a genius in his musicianship, and it was fascinating to work with him. And I got on quite well with him. Of course, I was young and fascinated by what he was doing. And I was quite happy rehearsing the pieces a lot because I hadn't played them hundreds of times, like most of the people in the orchestra.
Do you see a new trend in coming back forward to the present? Do you see a new trend or something in composition now that you will say it's something you haven't seen before? Do you think that's possible?
I haven't really seen any new trends because everyone's done everything, but there are always new things to do. I mean, now people are writing quartets that don't sound like quartets, electronically transformed or so transformed that you can't even tell they're string instruments. I'm not so fascinated by that sort of concept for the string quartet, but it can exist, and I think some composers can do interesting things with that. I would say that's probably the latest new trend, but it's not so new anymore. People have been doing it for some years, successfully or more successfully or less successfully. But I think it's difficult for composers to have their individual voice, and it's nice when you see someone today who is different, who is writing something and not copying someone else, or that someone else being a big influence on them.
How often do you see that in your composers? I know it's a tricky question, but just in general.
I think we do see it. We do see it. There are composers that shine out, but very young composers, student composers, people still studying, you don't see that because they're still influenced by what they have heard or hear. I used to be a composer, but I wrote like Ligety because he was the composer I felt closest to for a certain period of time in my late teens when I was studying at the Royal Academy of Music. You had to have a second study, and I couldn't play the piano. I wish I could, but I couldn't, and I didn't want to learn the piano. Somehow all your coordinates going through to do one thing, play the violin, play one line, the left and the right hand going together to do one thing, was what I could do, and I found it very difficult to try to do two things and have independent things in each hand. So I was really hopeless at the piano, which I felt a shame. So I studied composition and wrote music in those days. And as soon as I started playing the violin, I properly, post-studentship, I gave up composing. I realized that my compositions were not original, and it wasn't necessary for me to write music anymore. But all my compositions are located in a steel vault in the Sacher Stiftung, Sacher Foundation in Basel, because the entire archives of the Arditti Quartet and myself are there.
Okay.
And so I said, do you want my compositions? You don't really want them. They said, oh yes, we do. So they're preserved in these vaults like original Stravinsky scores,
Wow.
Webern scores. They have the original score of the two-piano version of The Rite of Spring. They have the original score of Webern's 5 pieces for string quartet, which is very interesting to look at. And the bagatelles, I think they have there. I mean, they have lots of contemporary composers. That's why they took us. They said we were the most relevant group because we were the group that played most of the music of all the composers that they have there.
Yeah.
And so that's why they wanted Arditti archives.
That's yeah. What about Lachenmann? Was it different or challenging for when you started working with his music? And can you tell me a little bit about how you worked with him?
Yes, it was very challenging working with Helmut Lachenmann. We rehearsed his first quartet. We didn't rehearse it enough. We didn't really understand how to make the sounds. And we had a performance in Cologne, which he attended. And in order to make the sounds, you really need to hold the bow in a different way and know how to do things with the instrument. And we spent some time, but I think in the concert we went back to doing things in a more natural way for a classical player, and some of the effects didn't work. And I think it's the only occasion, we laugh about this because we're very good friends now, but Helmut asked the promoter to pay his fare to London to work with us after the concert. So that next time we played it, this I thought was hilarious.
Yeah.
But I did say to him after the concert, I'm really sorry, we'll do better next time. And then in fact, when he wrote his second and third quartets for us, and we also played the very successful Tanz Suite for quartet and orchestra. And on those occasions, I invited him to stay with my house for 1 week, and we worked seriously, firstly independently with him, each player separately, and then putting the pieces together, because I realized that we needed that time to absorb properly exactly how to do the noise sounds that he wanted produced. And for me, that's really important, to understand exactly what a composer wants. But I think you have to hold the bow in different ways, and you have to know exactly how these sounds come out before you can do the piece properly. And then it really has to be ingrained in your system, so that when you're a little bit, I won't say nervous, but inhibited, maybe in a concert with an audience watching you, you don't go back to the more natural way of doing things that you know. You stick to what you've been taught to do and do it that way. And so he wasn't one of the early composers that we worked with. I could look it up. I don't remember when that performance of Grand Torso was, that first performance of ours in Cologne. But some years later, he wrote the second quartet for us, and that was even more complicated. It involved squadratura for strings, and then changing the squadratura midway through the piece, and all sorts of things, all sorts of complications of how to do things. They seem simple now, they're not complications anymore, because I know how to do them, and I've been doing them for years. But I know the first time and the first few years when you're having a piece like that, like those in the repertoire, and you're not 100% familiar with everything, you have to think that 1 or 2 or 3 bit more during the concert to make sure you're doing things right. Whereas if it's a normal piece with normal notation and normal sounds, you can use just your normal experience to fall back on when performing.
Okay. Do you think his notation is sufficient? I mean, because you have to deal with all the different techniques and the different sounds that will come from there. But what about getting the music? How does that work for you?
I think the notation is great, and I wish other composers, younger composers, would use his notation, because it's very clear and it's very logical. He has a good brain and he's thought it all out, and it's very logical the way he writes things. And when younger composers want to write the same sounds, I believe they should use his notation and not invent another one. Otherwise, this is twice as much work for the performer.
I see. That's interesting. Do you, I'm changing the topic one more time. Do you see a difference between the audiences in the US and in Europe or South America? Or do you care about that?
Not really, but I think the audiences are bigger in the US because they eat more.
Okay.
But not so good because they absorb the sound.
Depending on the hall could be a problem.
Yeah. No, but seriously, you see different sorts of audiences everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
There are audiences that know exactly what you're playing and come because you're playing it, because they know and have heard performances before, or CDs or broadcasts or whatever. And there are other audiences that are not so familiar. I like playing to both. I like playing to chamber music audiences who are not so familiar with contemporary music. And I love to playing in the kind of what we call ghetto situations.
Yeah.
The new music festivals where they know everything about what you're going to do and about the composers, maybe little known composers that you're going to perform, but they know them as young composers and they're waiting to see what these people can do for string quartet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's no hard and fast rule. If you're playing for a chamber music society, it's very different to playing to a new music festival, and that's the same everywhere for that. I think in some places people are more thirsty. In Latin America, I think it's possible to get very large audiences because people don't, it's far away, people don't often have lots of very good artists coming there. Economy's not good, they cannot afford sometimes the best people. And so when good people do come, they're thirsty and lots of people come to listen. And I think they have open minds. They're not so restricted
Mm-hmm.
to...
Mm-hmm. What about Asia? You think it's a similar...
I have very good experiences in Japan where we've played extensively over many years. I've never been to China. Don't know why. But never been to China. Been to Hong Kong 3 times, but not China. Been to Korea 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice festival in Tongyang, Isangyun's birthplace.
Mm-hmm.
They have a music festival there. But mostly I know about Japan.
Mm-hmm. And when you're the promoters or when you are selecting music, do you care about where the music comes from? Do you try to get music from different places, or you just look at the music and that's it?
I think if we go to places, promoters often want us to play some pieces from their own composers, and that's what I always liked doing. I called it the cross-fertilization process.
Okay, that's what I was going to get. Okay.
So you work with younger composers, not necessarily young composers, but you work with people who are not known outside of their country. They write you a piece, you play it in their country, you go there, and then you play that piece in other countries and make that composer known. We've done that with quite a few composers over the years. And I think that's a very nice thing to do, an important thing for the composers as well as for us. Yeah, so it's important. I like to play pieces from the land which we are in, of course, but I also like to take the masterworks that were written for us or that we play to these places, especially if we're going for the first time, because maybe people have heard them on CD but not live.
Yeah, that's great. And do you think about the future on whether the aesthetics or the styles that are developing, or what you want to do if you want to change something with the quartet or with yourself regarding repertoire, or I don't know?
I think I will go on playing new music because that's what I'm good at doing for as long as I can do it. I've always avoided the question of what it's going to be like in the future because I don't know. Times change and I have no idea in which direction people will go. But I will always give quality to what I do. And quality means to be able to be aware that I and my group are experts at what we do and can be very refined. And if music goes in a direction where you can't hear that anymore, then there will be no point in my existing or doing what I do.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as it doesn't go in that direction, then there will be composers who benefit and audiences who are interested in what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good.